Hello! Thank you very much for joining us for this video, where I will be introducing the basic ideas behind the different woodland types across the world, through looking at many that I've had the privilege to be able to visit. Woodlands from the Arctic to the highlands in the tropics. There are four basic factors that affect the development of woodland over time. These are latitude, providing warmth, rainfall, altitude, and the use of woodland by mankind. If we study woodland in the Western Palearctic, by which I mean Europe, North Africa, east to the Ural Mountains, moving down to the equator, it is possible to see how woodland developed over time. In equatorial latitudes, combining altitude and lack of warmth, woodland develops in much the same way as it would in the coldest parts of the world. Starting with the Arctic and the development of woodland in Europe after the last ice age, it starts with very few stunted species such as willows and birch. This is a photograph of the very first development of vegetation close to a glacier in Magdalena Bay in Spitsbergen. And here we are a little further south. This is near the town of Longyearbyen in southern Spitsbergen. This is North Cape, photograph taken I think in September in the extreme north of Norway, and you can see there we're beginning to start to get a certain number of very small woody plants. And the sort of plants you get are species such as this, which does not occur in Britain. This is the polar willow, Salix polaris, and here it is growing in its habitat. And there's a close-up of it, a very pretty little plant. And thirdly, we see it in fruit. After the last ice age, and today in the northernmost parts of the Arctic, this development can be seen at sea level. But moving south, the altitude at which this type of woodland develops increases. And dwarf birch, which is another of the woodland species that occurs in the coldest parts. After the last ice age, and today in the northernmost parts of the Arctic, this development can be seen at sea level, but moving south, the altitude at which this type of woodland develops increases. And here you can see in hills above Hammerfest in northern Norway the development of this sort of very dwarf scrub. And there you can see in the autumn species such as bilberry beginning to turn red. Thus in Norway, in sites such as Storsteinen, and here we are in Storsteinen above the town of Tromsø. This is reached by cable car from Tromsø, and on high mountains a flora consisting of alpine birch species, Betulinana, and several species of dwarf and often hairy willows develop. And here we are having a look at this same sort of very dwarf development of woody plants that you get in cold parts. Rainfall now becomes important, and several species of dwarf and often hairy willows develop. This is reticulate willow, Salix reticulata, which is one of them. This does occur in Scotland, but it's very rare there, and that is found at Storsteinen. And here you can see Salix laponum is a species of willow which is hairy, and often a lot of these plants that grow in cold places are hairy to protect them to a certain extent against the cold. It's another species that occurs at high level in Scotland. And here is the little blue mountain heath, which does not occur in Britain, which is another very dwarf woody plant that occurs in this sort of site. Now we move south to Iceland, and in the extreme north part of Iceland you have just the beginnings of what we think of looking like woodland, and this is hairy birch, which could just about manage to creep above the rocks, only just about. This is what we more think about as being woodland, and this particular example was seen in Iceland. Rainfall now becomes important, and in western Scotland, woodland can be seen containing 2 species of oak, 2 species of birch, and an ash, becoming the natural tree cover. If we move east, this is replaced by woodland dominated by Scots pine, birch, and alder. In Norway, woodland close to the west coast is rather similar to that seen on the Scottish west coast, but moving inland to the drier parts, Norwegian spruce takes over as the dominant tree. As one moves south, in Europe, as in France towards the Mediterranean, the number of tree species increases to include pubescent oak, another species of ash, and species of non-deciduous oak such as cork and holm oak, as well as silver fir. And we can see now that sort of woodland in the next photograph. The tree species there is the pubescent oak, and this photograph was taken near Le Perthus in southwestern France, close to the Spanish frontier. This increasing number of species continues in natural woodland until in the tropics the number of species in rain and cloud forest becomes enormous. And here you can see an example of tropical rainforest. You can see at the time it's raining, and actually in this woodland I think it rains for something like 250 days of the year. And if you could only see the number of species of tree there, it's enormous. However, at 10,000 feet, a woodland rather similar to the oak woodland in Europe can be seen at places such as Cerro de la Muerte in Costa Rica. A low tree species number is also seen in a site in the equatorial Andes near Papalacta, which supports just one small tree species, Polylepis incana, which is in the rose family. And now we have a look at this particular sort of woodland. Very dwarf. This is possibly an example of one of the highest level bits of woodland in the world. This is woodland where the very rare spectacled bear occurs. Of very great importance is the influence of man on woodland. The New Forest in Hampshire has probably been grazed since the last ice age. In the 11th century, William the Conqueror declared it the royal hunting forest where deer were encouraged for sport. People living in the New Forest kept animals in the woodland, and these too kept the overdevelopment of tree colonization to the right level. And here we are in the New Forest. And as you can see, this is South Ocknell Wood, one of the unenclosed woods of the New Forest. And you can see there that there's very good high light levels, and there's grass, and it's open. And this is the sort of woodland that one might have expected to occur in Northern Europe when grazing animals were in abundance. And here we are once more in the New Forest, a wonderful place to be. And you can see the development of an understory of bushes and so on. And these are very important, as we shall see, in the development of the New Forest. And here we are on the edge. In the New Forest, it is possible to see a natural circular development of the vegetation. starting with heathland. Over a period of time, the soil, following an era of low natural levels of fertilizer, is enriched by dying vegetation and birds. A scrub of hawthorn, which we can see here on the edge of the forest, is further enriched by dying vegetation and birds. Jays bury acorns under the scrub, some of which are not refound. Young saplings develop from the acorns, and light levels are sufficient for them to develop above the scrub, and a young oak woodland matures over the next 1,000 years or so. This woodland becomes senescent, or over-mature, as one might say, and begins to disappear as a result of gales and storms. Species such as beech, unlike oak, whose seeds can develop in low light levels, now take over. Compared with oak, beech is a short-living tree, and its leaves are rather acid and poor fertilizers. The beech trees die, producing an open landscape which develops into heathland. With high levels of grazing animals, some of the open landscape actually becomes heavily grazed and becomes natural grassland. Over the years, man has had a less than positive effect on woodland. Plantations for timber are notably very poor in their varieties of wildlife. In the new forest, such woodland is enclosed against grazing animals. In most parts of the country, areas are enclosed to keep animals in. But in the new forest, woodland is enclosed to keep the animals out. These enclosures are poor in wildlife, as are commercially grown softwood plantations. Burley Old Enclosure was de-enclosed some 400 years ago, and it has now at last taken on most of the characteristics of unenclosed woodland. In the 18th century, the keeping of stock moved from woodland into grassland that was improved using quantities of fertilizer. This gave rise to forest pasture, but the removal of grazing animals greatly altered the woodland areas. Development of a scrub layer became rampant, resulting in an almost total reduction of wildlife at ground level. Here in this photograph of Ebino Common, the woodland you can see has a very dense scrub layer. Actually, here, this scrub layer is important because it is used by bat species for hunting. There are parts, however, of Ebino Common which have been cleared of the scrub layer and where you get many more flowering plants. Light levels become low, which also greatly affected wildlife. Oak regeneration has become reduced so much that in his amazing book, Grazing Ecology and Forest History, Franz Vera predicts the eventual extinction of oak. Woodland now has to be managed for its wildlife by conservation that replaces the activity of the grazing animals. Many modern woodland managers now enclose woodland against grazing animals as a knee-jerk response. This practice is extremely counterproductive and should be greatly discouraged. As we move south in the world at ground level, so the richness of wildlife moves up towards the canopy. And here you can see at Sasha Lodge the development of the wildlife, a huge number of species, and if we could only be there in the early morning, the number of birds and insects and so on would be enormous. And in fact, by about 10 o'clock, the biting insects become so unpleasant that really one has to leave enjoying this lovely habitat because you get bitten to pieces. In low altitude rainforest, the number of plants and animals that can tolerate such levels is very limited. Life is abundant in the canopy. In many places in rainforest, ladders and stairs have been constructed around the largest and tallest trees, as have overcast cable cars been used, so that visitors can admire the richness of the wildlife. As I said before, early morning is the best time to visit the canopy. By 9 o'clock, the levels of biting insects is intolerable, and most of the birds have become inactive. Nowadays, man has some very negative influences on woodland. Equatorial woodland in parts of the world is felled in order to grow such things as palm oil, while in northern Europe the oldest forest is restricted to some 9,000 years by the last ice age. In the tropics there is some woodland that has probably stood since geological times. The effect of clearing forest is to take the important natural fertilizers and chemicals dissolved in rain to a lower level below the surface where a hard crust called a podzol develops. Particularly in hotter parts of the world, a desert develops, while in Europe a rather species-poor heathland is the result. Today, with the large amounts of nitrogen-based fertilizer in the atmosphere, heathland tends to develop in a very short time to a gorse or bracken monoculture, which shortens the lifespan of some heathland colonizers such as lichens. It is well known that woodland, especially in the tropical rainforests, are responsible for converting carbon dioxide into oxygen. The importance of these ancient woodlands as part of our history cannot be overemphasized. These woodlands have developed over time, during which the weather has altered in a specific way. This cannot be repeated. To think that ancient natural woodland can develop again following clearance is a myth. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope it has resulted in thoughts and that you will enjoy looking at future examples of woodland in the next lectures.